Bueno, estamos acá, vamos a repasar una interesante entrevista a quien es el heredero, digamos, del rey que tuvo Irán hasta 1979. Vamos a ir repasando un poco la historia, pero vamos a escuchar la entrevista primero.
City of Tehran and rural areas in a country of 90 million people, teenagers and retirees, the rich and poor. People from all walks of life are protesting Iran's weak economy in what is considered the most significant challenge to Iran's government in years. And these protests have persisted despite blackouts. That's right, internet access has been cut. Phone service shut down, with people communicating by passing notes by hand. And the very real threat of death exists. The human rights activist news agency said today that 500 protesters have been killed, but some estimates of the casualties are in the thousands. Eyewitnesses describe overflowing morgues and the situation at hospitals as extremely dire. There have been other movements in Iran over the past 2 decades, but some observers say this one feels different. Will the regime fall? And if it does, what happens next? And who will lead Iran? On the name of the lips of many of the protesters is that of my guest today. Reza Pahlavi is Iran's crown prince and the son of Iran's last Shah. At 17 years old, Pahlavi left Iran for fighter pilot training in the U.S., and less than a year later, in 1979, his father's regime fell and the current Islamic Republic was established, barring his return. Reza has lived in exile ever since, nearly 50 years. Reza Pahlavi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nora, for having me on your program.
I want to talk about this violent crackdown all weekend long in Iran. What are you hearing?
Well, it's a war between a regime against its own citizenry. The country is in full revolt, and unlike preceding uprising that Iran has witnessed in recent years, this time people are on the streets to put a final end to this regime. They demand a change of regime. They want to take this regime down. They are bravely confronting, unarmed, a regime that has used brutality in complete darkness that was imposed by cutting off communication, as you stated, internet. They are using military equipment, from armored tanks to AK-47, to shoot demonstrators to death. It's a massacre that the regime is, as a last gasp effort, trying to use to intimidate people because of being very thin in their troops, as a last gasp effort. But Iranians are resilient despite what the regime is trying to do. However, the most obvious question is, are we alone in this fight, or will this time the world respond to this brutality and come to their help and assist them to make sure that this time they will win, and this regime, which is on the verge of collapse, will finally concede and end this atrocity?
Well, the Iranian people appear to be listening to your calls for these protests. How are you communicating with people inside Iran, given that there has been this total blackout?
As of now, nearly 3 days ago, when the internet blackout occurred, obviously communication to Iran has been limited to satellite broadcasts. My recent messages in the last 48 hours has been carried out by an outlet called Iran International, which broadcasts messages into Iran. Before that, it was, of course, the use of social media platforms such as Instagram or Telegram, which, of course, now is impossible for people to have access to. Some people have limited access via Starlink. The regime is using military jamming to also try to disturb Starlink from operating in Iran. Further than that, the regime is now basically walking into people's homes, trying to confiscate even their satellite dishes. They're trying to do.
Acá estamos. Vamos a repasar primero quién es este señor que está hablando. Lo vamos a hacer muy resumido. El padre de este señor es el Shah Reza Pahlavi, que estuvo en el poder de Irán hasta 1979. En perspectiva de lo que pasó después, cuando cae el Shah y viene la revolución islámica, claro, era otro Irán de avanzada, El problema es que también hay que decir que cuando estaba Pahlavi, o sea, el rey, quien hoy sería el rey de Irán, también tuvo acusaciones de abuso de poder, de gobernar en forma autoritaria, de una policía secreta que se llamaba Savak, que perseguía, encarcelaba y torturaba opositores, de una prensa muy limitada. Digamos, el propio líder de la revolución islámica tuvo que estar exiliado. Entonces, por eso nosotros estamos viendo que así, como en este momento tienen un gobierno ultra restrictivo con las libertades individuales, lo mismo pasó en menor medida con el rey anterior. Digamos, pensemos que el líder revolucionario era el ayatolá Khomeini, que cuando iba a subir prometía libertad, justicia social, fin de la represión. En 1979 gana, logra imponerse porque el padre de este señor se escapa porque había una revolución muy fuerte, y al año, el ayatolá Khomeini al año prohíbe a las mujeres vestirse como quieren, la obligan a usar un velo, empiezan las restricciones del comportamiento a las mujeres. O sea, Irán viene de pasar décadas muy malas. Ahora hay una nueva revolución y este señor podría ser quien volviera a ocupar el poder en Irán. Todavía eso no está confirmado, pero por eso lo estamos escuchando. Vamos a ver qué sigue diciendo.
Anything possible to cut off our compatriots from the outside world. So this is really what we are faced with in terms of challenge. Nevertheless, the people are resilient. As you said, they are responding to my call. At their ask, I've stepped in to lead this period of transition and, of course, the combat in which we are right now. I have called on Iranian key sectors in the oil and gas industry, in the transportation industry, to join with the people and go on strikes. We are trying to, beyond controlling the major arteries and streets of major cities, providing them with certain goals to achieve and try to neutralize the regime's propaganda capability, which of course has to do with some aspects that deals with internet access or for their own media broadcasts within Iran. We're trying to do what we can as unarmed civilians against this brutal regime.
Reza, let me ask you that we have seen these protests and attempted revolutions in the past, the Green Revolution in 2009, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2022 with Mahsa Amini, and then 2023. What makes this one different?
One is that today the ask is not just for reform or, for that matter, an economic demand. It is now putting an end to this regime. This is really the revolution in its true sense of the word. And number two, I think that unlike some predecessors to the current president of the United States, he's a man that means what he says and says what he means. And I think people believe in that. So do I. I think this president knows what's at stake. The red lines that was drawn has been definitely surpassed by this regime. Although the regime, out of weakness, is yet again trying to trick the world into thinking that we are ready to negotiate once again and attempt to create a false climate of expectation in the outside world to sort of hope that this movement will taper off. But people are committed. We have no place to return. We have to move on, and we hope that this time we have solidarity in the world. I know a lot of people around the world have shown their sympathy and support of the Iranian people. I've heard many government leaders in Europe and elsewhere express their outrage and concern. But Nora, what's important is that the people on the street in Iran today say we are past condemnations, we are past resolution, we are past the stage of offering sympathy. We need action to be taken. The Iranians are fighting a fight defenseless and unarmed against an extremely brutal regime. The game changer would be for this regime to know that they cannot rely anymore on a continued campaign of repression without the world reacting to it. That's the game changer right there and then. And as I speak to you, people in Iran are still going back to the street to fight.
You brought up that word, what would be the game changer? And CBS News has learned that President Trump has been briefed on options for military strikes in Iran. He's going to get an updated briefing from his top military advisor and his Secretary of State on Tuesday. And the president has already said that he has some very strong options for Iran. Here's what he said on Air Force One last night when he was asked if Iran has crossed a red line. Let's listen.
There seem to be some people killed that aren't supposed to be killed. These are violent, if you call them leaders, I don't know if they're leaders or just they rule through violence. But we're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it. And we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination.
Reza, I heard you say this weekend that the U.S. should, quote, cut the snake's head off for good and, quote, make sure this regime goes down for good. Are you pushing President Trump to initiate regime change?
The president is clear when he says that he stands with the Iranian people. And he, like anybody else, believes, and so do I, that ultimately it's the Iranian people who determine their own fate, and it should be at their hand that change is brought. Solidarity with the Iranian people is ultimately supporting them in their ask, and their ask is that this regime has to go, and we have to overcome the obstacles by putting an end to it, and ultimately, as a result of that liberation, be able to finally be unshackled and free to establish a democratic alternative and come back to the world of nations that can work together for a different future of regional stability and peace and good relationship with our neighbors, with the Israelis, with our Arab neighbors, and bring that stability that is also in the best interest of America and the United States from a strategic viewpoint and ultimately in an economic sense in the future. So this is what's at stake right here. The opportunity is there.
And as you are urging people to protest and go to the streets, the death toll is rising in Iran. This violent crackdown continues just as it has in past attempted revolutions. I mean, is it responsible to be sending citizens in Iran to their deaths? Do you bear some responsibility? As I said, this is a war, and war has casualties. In fact, in order to preserve and protect and minimize the death toll, minimize innocent victims yet again be killed by this regime, action is needed. The regime is going to try and brutalize its citizenry as it has always done. But we are in a fight for liberation. I didn't ask the people to come to the streets to fight against the regime because I wanted so. They asked me to step in to help them and to be their voice on the outside world, to do everything that we can so we make this uprising successful this time. And I think we have some serious leaders that understand what is necessary, that understand the ask of the Iranian people and are responding to that. I think President Trump is responding to the call that the Iranian people have. The Iranian people have heard his words. They are naming streets after him in Iran. There's a difference. They know he's no Barack Obama or Joe Biden. And that's why they do have a higher expectation. And we'll see what happens. And as you say, I think the president has a decision to make fairly soon. We're doing what we need to do regardless of whether help will come or not. I'm just stating that the best way to ensure that there will be less people killed in Iran is to intervene sooner so this regime finally collapses and puts an end to all the problems that we are facing. We are at war, and we have to make sure that we are victorious. There's no way back for us. We know that as Iranians. And Reza, are you communicating directly with President Trump or members of the Trump administration?
Yes, we are.
And what has been your message?
I think the president said it best. He said, you know, we'll see what happens. And I think part of the consideration is that they already know what we propose as an alternative, as a transition. Right now, the focus is on the immediate issue. I think the world is waiting to see in what way the Iranian people will see that they are not alone in this fight and that the regime that has dared a response. We'll probably get an answer fairly soon. And that's important to embolden a nation. Look, any campaigns of liberation has occurred at the time that the world finally took the side of those people vis-a-vis oppressive regimes. That put an end to apartheid in South Africa. It put an end to the Soviet Union and liberated countries that were stuck behind the Iron Curtain. There's precedence in history. And I think Iran should not be the exception. In fact, the game changer for the whole region is Iran. And Iranians are fighting this fight not just to liberate themselves. They know that as a result of Iran's liberation, the whole world will breathe easier, that the stability that the whole world is looking for will finally achieve. Because unlike this regime that has always hated America and its allies, the Iranian people are supportive and want to be a friend of America and the rest of the world, of course.
Reza, one thing we have talked about is what is different about this particular revolution or this uprising. And one thing is that now many of the protests are rallying behind you, chanting slogans with your name in it. And I know you had talked about wanting to lead a transition. But I want to ask you about that, because here is what the Wall Street Journal wrote over the weekend. They said this: the 65-year-old Pahlavi's prominence is a departure from previous bouts of protest, when the heir to the controversial dynasty was rarely referenced. His father, who ruled Iran from the 1940s, was widely despised in Iran for his autocratic rule, his political repression, and what critics saw as his subservience to the U.S. Few analysts think Pahlavi has a real path to the throne or leadership in Iran. His improved reputation in recent years says more about the mounting discontent with the Islamic Republic than it does about a genuine desire by Iranians for a return of the monarchy, analysts said. So I want to allow you to respond to that, Reza. Why would you be the right person to lead such a transition? And why should people trust you to return the country of 90 million people and bring them towards a democracy?
Vamos a recordar que antes que se derrocara al padre de este señor que estamos viendo, Irán había hecho un acuerdo varios años antes para darle el petróleo a Gran Bretaña, incluso también a los Estados Unidos. Un acuerdo que no era para nada favorable para Irán. Por eso es que cuando llega Khomeini, al padre de este señor, al padre de Reza Pahlavi, se lo veía muy pro Estados Unidos, muy pro Gran Bretaña. Entonces lo que le pregunta a la periodista es: ¿por qué, si hasta el año 79 usted no era una su monarquía no era digna de seguir en el poder, por qué ahora sí va a tener que hacerlo? Él ahora claramente viene con un discurso democrático, lo cual está bien, pero no sabemos por qué, si se va un mal líder como está pasando ahora en Irán, tiene que venir un monarca del pasado y no pensar en una democracia. Puede ser que Irán aún no esté listo para eso, habría que hablar con especialistas. A ver qué dicen.
Well, it's interesting the way you characterize it, because if the people did not actually believe that I can be the person doing that for them, or the person to be trusted, there wouldn't be the millions on the streets of Iran, in the four corners of Iran, chanting my name and asking my...
La gente está desesperada, digamos. O sea, gritan el nombre de este señor porque no hay opciones, como gritaron el nombre de Khomeini, que después le sacó todas las libertades. Entonces, acá la pregunta sería, ¿por qué tiene que ser él? Pero acá está explicándolo.
They do. And that should be indicative of the reality on the grounds. But why is it that I offer my service to Iran? I'm answering their call. I've stepped in to lead this transition, and I have a plan for that. I have a whole host of people who are helping us, lawyers, jurists, economic experts. So we're not just talking about a regime that needs to go, we're also talking about what's the alternative. And in terms of the political alternative, it's a constitutional process. The interim government will be able to organize free elections so the people can send their representative in a constituent assembly to ultimately debate what ought to be and the final form that a future democratic secular system in Iran should take. I'm not here to...
Y lo que está hablando, que eso es lo que la gente quiere escuchar, está hablando de un Irán laico, un Irán laico. Recordemos que cuando se va el padre de este señor, y gana la revolución, se vota por un Estado religioso. Y cuando le obligan a las mujeres a usar el velo, salen a marchar. Estamos hablando de marzo de 1979. Y terminaron peor, sin libertades. Y ya lo vamos a hablar en otro video. Pero por eso ahora el mensaje que él da, lo cual me parece muy bien, es que va a tener una república laica.
Advocate for a republic or a monarchy. I'm here to be the honest broker above the fray in complete neutrality, making sure, however, that we have a fully transparent democratic transition. But the expectation of Iranians is to be able to have a smooth transition, to be able to have a stable transition, and that is why a big part of my campaign depends on having, unlike other scenarios of regime change in the region that did not pan out so well, the Iranian scenario includes maximum defections of elements that can be part of the solution. That is why I've launched this campaign many months ago, and we had over tens of thousands of respondents, members in the military, paramilitary forces, and the civil bureaucracy that will be able to be part of the solution in the future, so long as their hands is not soiled with the blood of the Iranian people. And that is something that will bring people a sense of confidence that they're responding to my call, that they can trust me in this, and I intend to do exactly what I said, to help them achieve that end. I'm a bridge and not the destination at this point.
But Reza, how can you promise and how can you make people who may doubt what's next with you in charge of a transition, that this will not be a return to a monarchy, that this will not be a future autocratic government?
Because they have followed my path and my track record for 46 years. From the very beginning, they know what I stood for. What I tell you today, Nora, is what I said 40 years ago. I've been a man of my word, and I'm my own man. And that's why they know who they're dealing with. It was difficult for them to have that information, but today's generation of young Iranians know even more about me than people of my own age. The fact is that they have followed me all these years. They understand where it is that I'm coming from. They understand my vision and, most importantly, my commitment to a democratic alternative. I live my life, most of my life, Nora, in a democratic world. I've seen the importance of institutions. I understand the importance of checks and balance. I understand what it takes to guarantee a society that we don't deviate from a democratic path and what's necessary to be done fundamentally, institutionally. It's not about somebody in charge at the top of a pyramid. It takes much more than that to maintain democracy. I've learned it. I prepared for it. I trained for it. And that's why I think that trust that you hear now in me is because they understand me, my goal, and what it is that I'm offering. And I'm responding to their call. I'm responding to their ask to step in and lead them. They call my name. They don't call somebody else's name. And that puts a huge load on my shoulder that I intend to discharge in the best of my abilities to heed their call and be a servant of my people and my nation.
But Reza, you have not been back to Iran in nearly 50 years, half a century. What would it mean for you to go back?
The whole world. Look, I've never felt detached from my homeland. I've always been in touch with my fellow compatriots, literally on a daily basis, in various ways. And, you know, as time went by, and we all now have a step to take back and look at the perspective of things, where Iran was going, where it happened since then, and where can we go from here. There's a whole host of experience that we have all gone through. And now we have a pretty good picture of where we want to be. We know
Reza,
exactly what we want and what we don't want.
Forgive me, Reza, I heard you say over the weekend that you are willing to die for this cause. What does that mean?
Yes. But look, the first time I was ready to die for a cause when I volunteered to join the Iranian Air Force during the Iraqi attack on Iran.
Bueno, vamos a ver esto que él está hablando. Este es el Shah, digamos, es el hijo del Shah, que este hombre se exilió a los 17 años, tiene 70. Se entrenó en Estados Unidos y después fue voluntario para luchar por Irán en la guerra Irán-Irak. Seguramente no lo habrán dejado. Bueno, y él por eso dice que está hace 50 años preparándose para este momento. Bueno, acá estamos.
And the breaking of the Iran-Iraq war, when the revolutionary government of Khomeini was already in place, my patriotic duty was asking me to, as a pilot, to go and fight alongside my military brethren in that war. I was prepared to die then. I'm prepared to die now. There's no greater cause for that, the liberty. And what is my life when I'm thinking of millions of young Iranians who today call my name? This young girl who a doctor in Tehran was operating on because she was shot in the face with bullets that had broken her jaw. The doctor said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going back to the street. I'm going back and I'm going to the streets and I wait until Reza, my leader, comes back and saves us." That's the degree of commitment they have. How could I not possibly be unprepared to die for them, to die for liberty, to die for saving our nation? I'm prepared to do that. I've trained for it all my life. I prepared for it all my life. And maybe this is a time that I can be there alongside them to fight the final battle.
Reza, when I have talked to my sources in the region about what is happening in Iran, they point out that there has been this cycle that we talked about, starting with the Green Revolution in 2009, and every year. And what occurs is people rise up in Iran wanting change, and then there is this violent crackdown with hundreds, thousands killed, and then it fizzles out because there are not cracks in the regime. There is not a crack and fissure within the elite. What can you say today that makes this any different? There's no sign yet that there have been any cracks in the regime.
Well, that's not accurate. There has been cracks in the regime. Defections are beginning to occur. In fact, as I said, there have been an outreach of elements that I've already said that are prepared to do that at significant levels of authority, both in the armed forces side as well as the civilians. They know that this regime is on the verge of collapse. They need to be ensured that they can really have a place in the transition, a place beyond this regime. And that's exactly the kind of dialogue we have with those elements. Khamenei, the first thing that happened during the 12-day war, he was hitting on the ground in a bunker. They are gearing up to escape from the country. They are loading up planes to take off and maybe end up in exiling themselves. That's how close it is. This is when we get intel from inside the secret meetings within, we call it Beit Rahbari, which is the supreme leaders, sort of inner circle of decision making. There's a lot of demoralized people sitting right there, including Khamenei himself. As I said, they're just using brutality just to hope that they can yet again intimidate the country and in total obscurity go ahead and do whatever they want to do. But what's different this time is people have had it. They're committed to liberate themselves. And I think Iranians know that unlike the past that they were thrown under the bus, at least under two different administrations, the first time in 2009 and Barack Obama was in charge, and lately under the Biden administration, which basically gave the regime, in a mode of appeasement, an opportunity to gather second steam. It's not going to happen this time. It's too much at stake to let this regime survive. It's not just us knowing it. I think many serious leaders in the world know that. And that's the difference between what happened before and the way it can happen this time.
And with you publicly calling for these protests and saying that you will be the leader of this transition, you have made yourself the face of this opposition in many ways. And I want to ask you, because Bobby Ghosh of Time magazine calls you a Pahlavi pretenders and says that you lack any meaningful organization with Iran. I want to allow you to respond to this. He wrote this, quote, "The Islamic Republic couldn't ask for a better foil than Pahlavi. His visibility allows the regime to portray protesters as tools of foreign powers and the discredited monarchy. Every photo op in Washington, every meeting with Israeli officials, every call for international intervention reinforces the regime's narrative and undermines the legitimacy of the protests." So again, what legitimacy do you have as the opposition and a potential leader of the transition?
A pesar que esta cadena de noticias está a favor del cambio del régimen, sin duda, las preguntas están bien, digamos, no lo deja no le deja de preguntar por qué tiene que ser él. Y las respuestas no me terminan de convencer. Vamos a escuchar, a ver.
On the walls, whose name are they chanting in the streets? I mean, I'm sure you have monitored the footages that came up in Iran in the last few weeks. Of course, the regime is going to try to build a narrative that would discredit me or attack me. In fact, they have committed agents to do exactly that, and for mainstream media to then again buy into that false narrative. But I refer you to the people on the streets in Iran in the four corners. They are very clear in what they're asking and identifying with who they want them to lead in the process. And yours truly's name is the only name that appears. I'm not saying this because I'm trying to cash in anything. I'm just telling you this is why I respond to their call. And I accept their ask for me to play my role in helping them in that process. That's the reality on the grounds. And I don't think that the regime in any kind of trickery or the apologies for the regime, and we know who they are, who have for long tried to lobby against Iranians who try to liberate their country and try to justify why this regime has to continue to be in place, won't be able to have a true case to offer. My case is made by the people in Iran themselves. And I'm just there to help them. And I know we will succeed despite the regime attempts to try to discredit me or the movement in whatever ambitions that they have in creating a false narrative of the reality.
Well, the world is watching very closely what is happening in Iran as those protests continue and as President Trump prepares to meet with his top military advisors tomorrow to discuss potential military options. Reza Pahlavi, thank you for joining us and for this conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you.
Bueno, y ahí terminaba la entrevista. Interesante, vamos a seguir el tema de Irán, 2.000 muertos hasta el momento y sigue siendo uno de los temas sin dudas del momento, así que lo estaremos compartiendo en más oportunidades. Gracias.